When historians look back at San Francisco in 1915, their attention usually goes to the spectacles above ground. The Panama Pacific International Exposition, the shining palace of fine arts, the tower of jewels glittering with thousands of cut glass gems, and the 18 million visitors who came to admire the city's rebirth after the 1906 earthquake. But the true story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one still buried in archival footnotes today, started beneath the waterfront. It began with a simple order for land reclamation. Engineers were told to prepare the mudflats and shallow waters of the bay for the massive exposition grounds. The intent was practical. Dredge the harbor floor, pump sediment onto the marshland, and create stable ground for pavilions, meant to showcase American innovation to the world. But once workers started excavating the bay floor, something unexpected occurred. They broke through structures that hadn't seen light in decades. Below the mud and silt, deeper than any known construction should have reached, crews discovered metal frameworks and cylindrical housings that didn't match any documented infrastructure. Their design was strange. Their purpose was obscure, and the components resembled nothing in the electrical catalogs of that period. They didn't even look like European power systems, as commonly understood. Public reports about the exposition never mentioned this. The newspapers celebrating San Francisco's recovery didn't carry the story. But in the internal notes from that year, a quiet phrase recurs. APRI, existing installations, unexpected configuration, origin unknown. The official account later dismissed all of this as abandoned telegraph gear, old maritime signal equipment, or simply misidentified debris from pre-earthquake construction. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussing. Yet the dredging photographs from the time, developed in dim engineering offices, while San Francisco prepared its grand celebration, tell a different story. They show workers beside metal towers set into bedrock far beneath the bay floor. Frameworks fitted together with precision far tighter than any riveting of that era should allow. Cylindrical housings with internal mechanisms that don't match any known American manufacturing, but something more complex, more uniform, more deliberate. And the deeper they dredged, the less the structures looked like abandoned infrastructure as we know it, and more like technology that had been submerged, concealed, and intentionally forgotten. At first, the dredging crews tried to classify everything in the simplest possible terms: old pier foundations, abandoned cable housings, debris from pre-quake waterfront development. But as documentation grew and more structures emerged, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some metal frameworks built to tolerances far tighter than any fabrication shop of the time could achieve? Why were certain components shaped identically, as if mass-produced rather than custom-forged? Why did some systems extend into the bay floor far beyond the footprint of any documented pier or wharf? And the question that troubled even the most seasoned engineers: why were these structures so sophisticated? San Francisco in 1915 was electrifying rapidly, yet the infrastructure beneath parts of the bay appeared built for energy transmission that no contemporary engineer could identify. Dredging teams quietly admitted among themselves that the design and precision didn't match any known utility company. And although none of them used terms like a lost technology, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built an energy grid here before. Not simple telegraph lines, not primitive arc lights. Something else entirely. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports grew shorter. Descriptions became vaguer. Photographs stopped showing the widest views of the discoveries. Then, in mid-1915, the excavation zones were partially covered again, buried beneath tons of dredged sediment needed for exposition foundations. And much of what had been exposed was returned to darkness under the new landfill. Only fragments remain: notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of engineers who saw the installations before they were buried. But even from what survives, a pattern emerges: infrastructure too advanced for any known power company, components too precise for the accepted timeline, engineering methods that look inherited rather than invented, technology that seems to belong to a different era of development entirely. When the dredging teams moved past the first recognizable layers beneath the waterfront, their expectations were simple. They thought they would find bay mud, perhaps some old pier pilings, and scattered remnants from pre-earthquake construction. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks, that assumption collapsed. Instead of a neat sequence of sediment layers, the teams uncovered a grid of technological installations that didn't behave the way abandoned infrastructure is supposed to. The first anomaly was spacing. Each installation, whether near the Marina District, Treasure Island waters, or the Embarcadero, seemed to follow the same geometric pattern, the same distance intervals, the same angular relationships. Different locations shouldn't do that. Different builders, different purposes, different years don't build in perfect geometric harmony across kilometers of waterfront. Yet beneath San Francisco Bay, they did. Towers from one section aligned precisely with towers discovered in completely different areas. Power conduits shared the same trajectory, even when separated by hundreds of meters of open water. It was as if every component belonged to an original grid, one that no longer existed in any utility company record. As workers dredged deeper, the structures grew stranger. Beneath the expected mud and occasional ship debris, they began encountering installations that looked nothing like contemporary equipment: much larger housings, much more complex internal mechanisms, configurations that seemed too mathematically exact for anything in San Francisco's documented timeline. Some structures appeared almost over-engineered: cylindrical towers with perfect symmetry, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude factories of the time. Then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering team's: wireless transmission apparatus. Not cables, not wires, but metal frameworks designed for broadcast transmission. Towers with geometric coil arrangements, housings with resonance chambers, lower sections with grounding systems that only make sense for high-frequency energy distribution. Yet there is no historical record of San Francisco ever having wireless power transmission before 1915. No documents showing any company attempting broadcast electricity at this scale. Nothing that explains why large sections of the bay floor were equipped with infrastructure resembling Nikola Tesla's theoretical wireless systems, but built years before Tesla's public demonstrations and decades before any practical implementation. Dredging photographs from 1915 show this clearly: workers standing beside towers so tall the men look miniature in comparison. Components machined so precisely that even today electrical engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Coil arrangements and resonators that resemble experimental wireless technology far more than anything turn of the century America is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the months after the exposition barely mentioned these features. Some drawings omit the tower installations entirely. Certain structures are summarized with vague terms like as maritime debris or as earlier equipment. even though the photographs show they were far more complex. The silence is hard to miss, because if these deeper discoveries truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual transmission systems documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across private engineering firms, instead of gathered into a single municipal report? Even some of the components raised red flags: surfaces too smooth, joints too precise, coil windings too uniform, marks that look less like hand assembly and more like precision manufacturing. Manufacturing that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those towers were supposedly built. The deeper the teams dredged, the harder it became to fit these findings into the clean, linear narrative of San Francisco's electrical development. Because installation by installation, the bay floor began to look less like abandoned telegraph equipment and more like a buried power grid. A system built, operated, and submerged at some point before recorded history, yet somehow remaining intact enough that 1915 engineers could recognize its purpose, even if they couldn't explain its origin. When the dredging teams pushed deeper into the bay floor, the discoveries stopped resembling anything that belonged to a clean and orderly industrial timeline. What they began uncovering were systems that didn't match American engineering, didn't match European design, and didn't even match each other in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange technological language, one that seemed to come from a unified source, yet somehow preceded everything in the historical record. The first shock came with the transmission chambers themselves. These weren't crude wooden platforms or simple metal frames. They were geometrically perfect structures, chambers shaped with exact dimensions, cylindrical housings that maintained their form flawlessly despite decades underwater, and power distribution frameworks laid out with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master grid that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, encased in concrete so dense that workers thought they had encountered natural rock formations. But once broken open, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed: smooth metal walls, fitted components, and machinery that raised more questions than answers. Then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the giant resonance towers. Officially, they were later labeled as abandoned lighthouse foundations or old pier supports, but nothing about them fits typical maritime construction. They were too symmetrical, too precisely engineered, and too perfectly tuned, as if designed with tools capable of calculating electromagnetic resonance frequencies. Some towers were tall enough to have extended above the water line before submersion. Others contained internal coil mechanisms that appeared designed for energy amplification. Workers from 1915 described them in private correspondence as broadcast antennas, not support structures, but transmission devices with a wireless purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been or who built them. Another anomaly appeared in the grounding systems. These were not simply metal plates driven into mud. Many were integrated into the bedrock itself, positioned at angles that made no conventional sense for lightning protection or static discharge. They were embedded in stone that clearly predated any American settlement, connected to conduits that ran horizontally across the bay floor rather than vertically to the surface. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The exposition buildings above ground may not simply rest on reclaimed land. They may sit atop something much larger, an energy infrastructure whose purpose was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of the city. The deeper the workers dredged, the stranger the findings became. Metal components appeared with perfectly uniform thickness. Some surfaces were finished smooth, almost frictionless. Others showed precision, cut threads so clean that modern machinists still argue about what tools could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the material composition of certain insulators. Some pieces were made of ceramic compounds that material scientists in 1915 couldn't identify. Others showed crystalline structures that only form under conditions far beyond any kiln or furnace of the era. The official explanation offered later: unusual mineral deposits, imported materials from the Orient, does not explain why these materials appear in engineered components, not raw form shaped, processed, manufactured into precise electrical insulators and capacitors. That kind of material science requires techniques far beyond early 20th century capability, far beyond anything recorded in American industrial history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Chambers were filled with sediment again. Tower bases were covered. Deep sections of the bay floor were isolated from further dredging. Some of this was officially labeled as safety concerns, necessary to create state-stable ground for the exposition structures above. But the decisions about which installations to bury first and which areas to cover permanently raised quiet questions among observers, because the structures that were reburied immediately were always the ones containing the most anomalous technology. The resonance towers, the unknown ceramic insulators, the integrated grounding systems, the transmission chambers that seemed to connect to infrastructure extending far beyond the exposition grounds. These connecting conduits were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random pipes. They were part of an organized grid, a network of energy distribution that looked less like abandoned equipment and more like a continental system, aligned, standardized, planned as if they once transmitted power to every major city on the Pacific coast through an underground and underwater mechanism we no longer recognize. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again, their chambers filled, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent maps. When you study the final weeks of the 1915 land reclamation project, something becomes impossible to ignore. The dredging didn't end. It was stopped. Not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the crews went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be recorded. And this is where the final mystery begins. Because the last installations they uncovered beneath San Francisco Bay weren't ordinary. They weren't telegraph equipment. They weren't lighthouse foundations. They weren't even identifiable as any known type of infrastructure. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described technology that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Housings with tolerances so tight you couldn't fit paper between components. Resonance coils wound with precision that early 20th century America was never supposed to have. Transmission chambers built to distribute energy far greater than anything documented in the city above, and conduits extending beyond the dredging zone, disappearing into darkness beneath the modern bay. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced technology was the equipment that was reburied the fastest. Workers described filling entire chambers back in, covering tower foundations, packing sediment into installations that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. The official explanation: structural concerns, exposition deadlines, material shortages, doesn't hold up. If it was only about construction schedules, why was the most sophisticated, most precisely engineered infrastructure sealed first? And why was the obviously corroded debris left exposed for documentation? It doesn't make sense, unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath San Francisco Bay truly showed engineering far beyond early 20th century capability, and if some of that technology didn't match any known power company at all, then the entire accepted story of American electrical development begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if a World's Fair was built on top of something far older, something advanced, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the bay floor wasn't just convenient real estate, but a deliberate burial ground for technology that challenged every assumption about when wireless power transmission became possible. And maybe that is why the 1915 discoveries were quietly reburied, not to protect the construction site, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story: workers standing next to towers that look almost modern, components that resemble Tesla coils decades before they became common, systems too integrated, too sophisticated for their supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question. A question no archive, no textbook, no official publication has ever answered fully. Why was the most advanced evidence, the most sophisticated technology, the most anomalous infrastructure sealed away again beneath the bay? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The resonance towers were buried. The wireless transmission chambers were buried. The unknown insulators were buried. The integrated power grid was buried. And even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the land reclamation had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the 1906 earthquake, older than American settlement, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in 1915, the bay opened just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they covered it again, buried it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if San Francisco stands on top of an energy grid built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1915. It's what else lies beneath the waterfronts of the world. What other harbors? What other bays? What other convenient land reclamation projects covered something that was never meant to be found? The 1915 wireless energy pylons weren't just abandoned infrastructure from a forgotten era. They were a glimpse, a brief, accidental glimpse, into a version of history we were never meant to see. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.